Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ron should have known better than to pick a fight in a place like this. But after weeks of trading in the colonies, dealing with backstabbing merchants and barely scraping by with enough credits to refuel his ship, he needed a drink. The bar reeked of sweat, cheap liquor, and the distinct musk of too many species packed into one low-lit, grimy establishment. It was the kind of place where fights weren't just common, they were expected. A watering hole for off-world traders, mercenaries, and warriors looking to blow off steam. Ron had been to enough of them to know the rules. Keep your head down, don't make eye contact with anything that looks like it could rip you in half, and most importantly, never ever start something you can't finish. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of the chaos, fists clenched, blood trickling down his split lip as he glared at the alien across from him. It had started simple enough. Some idiot tried to snatch his credits, and Ron, not in the mood to be robbed today, had broken the guy's nose. That should have been the end of it, but no, the bastard had friends. The brawl that followed was a blur of thrown punches, overturned tables, and enough shattering glass to make the bartender weep. Ron held his own, ducking and weaving between the swings of a particularly heavy-set reptilian before clocking him in the jaw and sending him sprawling. He might have made it out of this unscathed if he hadn't grabbed the nearest bottle of local rotgut, turned, and thrown the contents directly into the face of the wrong alien. The room went silent. Ron barely had time to register what he'd done before the massive shadow loomed over him. At first, he thought it was just another bruiser, maybe one of the gang members looking for revenge. But then he looked up, way up, at the towering figure before him. She was huge, built like a war machine wrapped in fur, battle scars running across her arms like marks of honor, and piercing golden eyes locked onto him like a predator sizing up her prey. The thick ridged tail behind her twitched once, the only sign of movement in the deathly quiet bar. Then she grinned, baring gleaming fangs, and let out a low, rumbling chuckle that made Ron's gut twist in the worst way possible. "You challenge me, little male?" Her voice was deep, laced with amusement, but there was something dangerous beneath it, a sharp edge that sent a shiver of instinctual warning down his spine. Challenge? Oh hell no. Ron wasn't stupid enough to challenge someone who looked like she could throw him through a wall with one hand. This was a misunderstanding, a bad one, and I need to clear it up before things get even worse. He raised his hands, forcing a nervous chuckle. Listen, that wasn't meant for you, just a mistake, all right? No hard feelings. Her grin widened, which was not the reaction he was hoping for. No hard feelings, she repeated, tilting her head slightly, unless you lose. Before he could respond, a roar of excitement erupted from the crowd. The bar patrons surged forward, some already pushing tables aside, others laughing and clapping as if they just won the night's entertainment jackpot. A few exchanged bets, shouting numbers Ron didn't want to think about. It hit him all at once. There was no talking his way out of this. He was in an alien bar in an alien colony where their rules applied, and whether he liked it or not, he had just entered a challenge he had no way of winning. The beast woman stepped back, gesturing toward the open space that had suddenly been cleared for them. Her posture was relaxed, casual, like she already knew exactly how this would end. Ron swallowed hard, his brain racing for an escape plan, but there was no way out. The only thing more dangerous than fighting her would be backing down now and looking weak in front of a crowd that thrived on strength. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to focus. He had fought bigger opponents before. Hell, he'd survived worse than this. If he could just hold his own long enough, maybe he could make it out of this with his pride and, more importantly, his bones intact. The crowd surged closer as Ron stepped forward, shaking off the last bit of hesitation. The beast woman, Zora, someone muttered her name in the crowd, watched him with a predator's patience, waiting for him to make the first move. He didn't. Instead, he sized her up, looking for weaknesses, anything he could use. She was big, but that also meant she had more weight to throw around, which meant she had to have slower reflexes. If he could stay out of her reach, he might be able to wear her down. Then she moved. Ron barely had time to react before she lunged, closing the distance between them in an instant. He dodged, barely feeling the rush of air as her fist swung past his head. He dropped low, pivoting to the side, using his speed to avoid a follow-up strike. She was fast, but he was faster. Maybe this wouldn't be completely impossible. He swung, aiming for her side, and his fist connected, only for it to feel like he just punched solid stone. Pain shot up his arm, and before he could react, she grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward like he weighed nothing. Not bad, she mused, her voice still carrying that dangerous amusement. Then she threw him. Ron hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively to soften the impact, but the wind had been knocked out of him. Before he could get back on his feet, she was already on him. A powerful hand pressed against his chest, pinning him down with ease, her other arm braced against the ground beside his head, leaning in close, her fanged grin filling his vision. "You fight well, little male," she murmured, and to his shock, her tone wasn't mocking, it was pleased. "Strong, fast, bold." Ron groaned, trying to push her off, but she didn't budge. "Glad you're impressed. Now how about letting me up?" She laughed low and throaty. Then, to his complete and utter horror, she leaned in closer, golden eyes gleaming. "I accept your mating challenge." The words didn't register at first. When they did, his brain short-circuited. Wait, what? The crowd exploded in cheers, warriors pounding their fists against their chests, voices overlapping in celebration. Ron's stomach dropped. He looked up at her desperately, trying to form words to fix whatever the hell just happened, but Zora just grinned wider. "You are mine now, little mate," she purred. "Best rest well, you have much to prove." Oh, shit. Ron had faced plenty of bad situations in his life, but this was a whole new level of disaster. He lay there, still pinned beneath the massive weight of Zora, her golden eyes watching him like he was some fascinating new challenge. Around them, the gathered warriors roared in excitement, already celebrating the mating challenge that he had absolutely not intended to issue. He needed to correct this now, before things got even more out of hand. Ron forced a tight, uneasy chuckle, raising his hands in the universal gesture of, "Hold on, let's talk about this." "Okay, not sure what kind of customs you've got here, but I think we had a little misunderstanding." Zora leaned in close, the weight of her hand pressing into his chest, her thick tail twitching against his leg as if she was enjoying his struggle. "You fought well," she murmured, her deep, gravelly voice carrying something almost approving. "You claimed me in combat. Do not disgrace yourself by trying to withdraw now." "I didn't claim anything. This was just a bar fight, an accident. You can't seriously think I meant to." A clawed finger pressed against his lips, silencing him instantly. "A warrior does not regret their victories," she said, amusement glinting in her eyes, "and neither should a mate." Before Ron could protest further, she lifted him effortlessly, like he weighed nothing at all. A strong arm curled around his waist, pulling him up against her chest as she rose to her full, intimidating height. The crowd around them went wild, warriors stomping their feet, others slapping Ron's back as if he had just won some great honor instead of stumbling into an alien misunderstanding that would likely get him killed. He struggled in her grip, which only made her chuckle again, a low and throaty sound that sent a chill down his spine. "You will learn," she murmured, carrying him effortlessly through the crowd. "Come, the tribe must witness our bond." Ron's blood ran cold. "Oh, hell no." He twisted, trying to pry himself free, but it was like struggling against a boulder. "Look, I appreciate the hospitality and all, but I really need to be anywhere else right now." "Silence, mate," Zora purred, tightening her hold just enough to make it clear that she wasn't letting him go. "You have much to prove." That did not sound promising. The tribal warriors escorted them out of the bar and through the settlement, a sprawling mass of structures built from a mixture of stone and reinforced metal, the kind of rough, battle-worn place where only the strongest survived. Fires burned in large pits, casting flickering light over the gathered warriors, all of whom looked at Ron like he was some sort of prized curiosity. Some muttered in their deep, guttural language, others exchanged knowing smirks. It didn't take a genius to figure out that whatever mating challenge he had stumbled into wasn't something taken lightly. Zora carried him all the way to what could only be described as a war camp built around a massive elevated platform that overlooked a sprawling training ground. She finally set him down, but before he could make a run for it, she grabbed his wrist, raising his arm high above his head as she turned to address the tribe. "This human has claimed me in combat," she declared, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. "As is our way, he must prove himself worthy." A collective roar of approval surged through the crowd. Ron, still winded, still trying to make sense of any of this, managed a strangled laugh. "You people have a really loose definition of claiming, you know that." Zora ignored him, instead releasing his wrist and stepping forward, towering over him as she crossed her arms. "You will undergo the trials," she stated simply. "If you pass, you will remain at my side. If you fail, you may leave, but you will leave broken." The way she said it sent an unpleasant chill through him. This wasn't just some game to her. It wasn't a joke. He looked around at the gathered warriors, all watching him with an unsettling mix of curiosity and expectation. They wanted to see this. They wanted to see if he had what it took to stand beside their alpha. And worse, Zora wanted it too. Ron exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. And what exactly do these trials involve? Zora's lips curled into a wicked smirk. Strength, endurance, will. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only he could hear. I do not expect you to win, but I expect you to try. The way she said it sent a jolt through him, not quite a threat, not quite a promise. His stomach twisted, but at the same time, something flickered in the back of his mind, something reckless, something that whispered, you could do this. He should run, he should refuse, but instead Ron squared his shoulders, leveling his gaze with hers. Fine, he said. Let's get this over with. The tribe erupted in cheers. Zora's grin widened. Good, she purred. Then let us begin. With that, the crowd surged around them, warriors calling out bets, some grinning like they were already picturing his failure. He was ushered toward the training grounds where a massive circular pit had been cleared for the trials. As Ron stepped forward, his heart pounded. He had just signed up for something way beyond his control, and yet deep down he couldn't deny the small, infuriating part of him that wanted to see this through because, for better or worse, he wasn't about to back down now. The pit was larger than Ron expected, a wide stretch of dirt surrounded by towering wooden posts wrapped in thick rope. The torches around the perimeter cast long, flickering shadows, giving the entire arena a primal, ritualistic feel. Warriors lined the edges, some perched on wooden beams, others standing with arms crossed, watching with a mix of amusement and curiosity. Ron felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken expectation pressing down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just entertainment to them. This was tradition, something woven into the very fabric of their culture. The idea made his stomach twist because it meant there was no way out of this, not unless he wanted to lose whatever shred of dignity he had left. Zora stood at the other end of the pit, arms crossed, her golden eyes gleaming in the firelight. She didn't look remotely concerned, which made sense. She had nothing to lose. He was the one with everything on the line, the one who had to prove himself, the one who had to survive whatever trials she and her people had planned. A deep, guttural voice boomed across the pit, cutting through the low hum of conversation. The outsider will face 3 trials. The first, the hunt. Ron exhaled slowly, shoulders tensing. Hunt was a pretty broad term, and given what he'd seen of this planet so far, he doubted it meant tracking down some harmless little animal. Zora took a slow step forward, watching him. You will have 1 hour, she said. The jungle is vast. You will be given a weapon. If you return with nothing, you will have failed. Straightforward enough, but that didn't make him feel any better about it. Before he could respond, one of the warriors stepped forward, holding out a curved blade, more like a large hunting knife than anything else. Ron took it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It was heavier than he expected, the edge honed to a razor-sharp finish. Not exactly the best weapon for whatever they expected him to take down, but he wasn't about to complain. A second warrior motioned him toward the far end of the pit, where a crude gate had been lifted, revealing the thick jungle beyond. The torches didn't reach that far, leaving the entrance shrouded in darkness. Ron inhaled, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to push past the unease settling in his gut. He had no choice. With one last glance at Zora, who was still watching him with that unreadable expression, he stepped forward and disappeared into the jungle. The moment the foliage swallowed him, everything changed. The sounds of the cheering warriors faded, replaced by the deep, resonant hum of the wilderness. Insects buzzed, distant creatures howled, and something massive rustled in the undergrowth not far from where he stood. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wild plant life, a mixture of unfamiliar aromas that sent his instincts into overdrive. He had no idea what lived in these jungles, no idea what kind of creatures lurked in the shadows, but he didn't have time to waste being cautious. Moving carefully, he navigated through the dense vegetation, keeping his grip firm on the hunting knife. His mind raced with possibilities. If this was a test, then they expected him to bring back something worth their respect. That meant whatever he was hunting wasn't small, probably wasn't friendly either. Minutes passed in tense silence, his eyes scanning the darkness, his ears tuned to every shift in the jungle around him. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, barely audible but deep enough to make the hair on his arm stand on end. He turned slowly, muscles coiling, instincts screaming at him to be ready. Something moved in the underbrush. Ron crouched slightly, heart pounding, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the faint sound of movement, something heavy, something big. Then, without warning, the jungle exploded around him. A massive form burst through the undergrowth, all muscle and fur, gleaming eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a creature with powerful limbs, razor-sharp claws, and a mouth lined with jagged fangs. Ron didn't hesitate. He threw himself to the side just as the beast lunged, narrowly avoiding a swipe that would have torn him apart. He hit the ground hard, rolling into a crouch, his mind working faster than his body. He couldn't outrun this thing, and with nothing but a knife, he couldn't afford a direct fight. He had to be smart. The creature snarled, turning toward him, muscles tensing for another attack. Ron tightened his grip on the blade, forcing himself to focus. When it charged again, he didn't move, not until the last possible second. Then he dropped, rolling beneath it, slicing upward as he passed beneath its chest. The blade connected. A pained roar filled the air as the beast stumbled, blood splattering against the foliage. It wasn't enough to kill it, but it was enough to wound it, enough to give Ron an opening. He didn't waste it. Springing to his feet, he pivoted sharply, dodging another strike before launching himself onto the creature's back. It thrashed violently, trying to throw him off, but he held on, driving the knife into the side of its neck. The blade sank deep. The beast let out one final, shuddering growl before collapsing, its massive body hitting the jungle floor with a dull thud. Panting, Ron pulled the knife free, his entire body shaking from adrenaline. He had done it. Somehow, against all odds, he had won, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Wiping sweat from his brow, he crouched beside the beast, examining it. It was big, too big to carry back on his own. He'd have to take proof, something undeniable. He grimaced but didn't hesitate, using the blade to cut deep, severing one of the creature's fangs. It took more effort than he liked, but eventually the long, curved tooth came free. He held it up, breathing heavily, his mind still catching up with everything that had just happened. Then he turned, making his way back toward the war camp. By the time he emerged from the jungle, the gathered warriors were still waiting, murmuring amongst themselves. The moment they saw him, covered in dirt, sweat, and blood, the massive fang clutched in his hand, the murmurs turned into something else: respect. Zora's eyes flickered with something unreadable as he stepped forward, tossing the fang onto the ground between them. "Satisfied?" he muttered, still catching his breath. For a long moment she just stared at him. Then, to his absolute shock, she laughed, a full, deep, throaty laugh rich with something almost pleased. "Perhaps," she said, stepping closer, tilting her head. "Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought." Ron exhaled sharply, hands on his hips, exhaustion setting in. "Glad we're making progress." Zora smirked, and before he could react, she reached out, grabbing his chin between her fingers, tilting his head up to meet her gaze. "Do not celebrate yet, little mate," she murmured. "You still have much to prove." Ron swallowed hard, pulse racing. This was far from over, and somehow he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be. The moment Ron tossed the bloodied fang at Zora's feet, the entire war camp erupted into cheers. The deep, guttural voices of the warriors blended into a chorus of approval. Drums pounded in the distance, a rhythmic, primal beat that echoed through the night air. Ron barely had time to catch his breath before warriors clapped him on the back, some shaking his shoulders, others laughing in rough, boisterous voices. He had seen this kind of camaraderie before on battlefields, among soldiers who had fought together and survived, but here, in this alien camp surrounded by towering figures who had minutes ago been sizing him up as an outsider, it felt different. They weren't just acknowledging his survival. They were welcoming him in a way that sent a strange sensation curling through his chest. Zora had been silent during the commotion, watching him with those golden eyes, her thick, furred arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It wasn't until the initial rush of celebration began to die down that she finally moved, stepping forward, her tail flicking lazily behind her. The warriors quieted instantly, waiting for their alpha to speak. She bent slightly, picking up the bloodied fang, rolling it between her fingers as if testing its weight. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing expression that sent warning bells ringing in the back of Ron's mind. "You survived," she murmured, her voice carrying easily across the gathered warriors. "I expected you to run or to fail." Ron exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't know me very well." Her smirk widened. "No, but I will." The way she said it sent an uneasy jolt down his spine. Before he could respond, she lifted the fang high, displaying it to the gathered warriors. The outsider has passed the first trial, she declared, and another round of cheers rose into the night. Tomorrow, we see if he has the endurance to match his spirit. Ron frowned. Endurance. She grinned, flashing sharp fangs. You will learn soon enough. The crowd began to disperse, warriors heading toward the fires, food being passed around as the energy of the night shifted from combat to celebration. Ron exhaled, rolling his shoulders, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He had barely eaten all day, had just wrestled a jungle beast with nothing but a knife, and now apparently he had another trial waiting for him. Just fantastic. Zora motioned for him to follow, turning on her heel and striding toward the large, tent-like structure at the center of the camp. Ron hesitated, glancing around at the warriors, but no one seemed to object. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before falling into step behind her. The inside of the tent was surprisingly spacious, dimly lit by hanging lanterns, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and something vaguely floral. Thick furs were strewn across the floor, along with various weapons, armor, and what looked like ancient relics stacked in neat piles. This wasn't just a tent. It was a throne room, a personal space meant for someone of high status. Zora moved toward a large, cushioned seat, her tail flicking idly as she turned back to him. You did well today, she said, voice softer now, more measured. Better than I expected. Ron huffed, leaning against one of the wooden support beams. Glad to exceed expectations. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she reached for a pitcher of thick, dark liquid and poured it into a carved wooden cup. She held it out to him. Drink. He eyed it warily. What is it? She raised a brow. A gift, a warrior's drink given only to those who have earned it. Ron hesitated, then took the cup, sniffing it. The scent was strong, rich, almost like a mix of honey and spiced liquor. Deciding he had already risked enough today, he took a sip. The warmth hit him instantly, spreading through his chest, a deep burn that settled into something pleasant. He exhaled slowly. All right, that's not bad. Zora smirked. I would not waste good drink on a weak mate. Ron choked slightly. Still not your mate. She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with amusement. You have passed one trial. 2 remain. Should you succeed, we will see if you still argue. Ron groaned, setting the cup down. What's next? She leaned forward slightly, her massive frame casting a shadow over him. Endurance, she repeated, voice almost teasing. Strength of body, strength of will. Tomorrow you will run. Ron frowned. Run. Zora grinned. All night until only the strong remain. His stomach dropped. Fantastic, he sighed, rubbing his temples. Of course, because wrestling a jungle beast wasn't enough. Zora chuckled, settling back in her seat. Rest while you can, little mate. Ron knew arguing was pointless. He sighed again, resigning himself to whatever insane trial awaited him in the morning. But as he settled onto the thick furs laid out for him, exhaustion finally pulling at his limbs, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. He wasn't just surviving this anymore. Somewhere along the way, he had started playing along, and that was dangerous. Ron barely had time to rest before the morning came too soon, marked by the deep, rhythmic pounding of war drums echoing through the camp. His body ached from the previous night's fight, every muscle screaming in protest as he forced himself up from the thick furs he'd collapsed into. The warrior's drink Zora had given him still lingered in his veins, warming his core, but it wasn't enough to dull the exhaustion weighing down on him. He had fought, he had hunted, and now apparently he was expected to run. Outside, the war camp was already alive with movement. Warriors stretched and prepared, some sharpening weapons, others sharing hushed conversations that faded as soon as they caught sight of him stepping out of Zora's tent. The attention was different now, not just curiosity, but expectation. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a contender, someone being tested, measured against their standards. That should have unsettled him, but somehow it only made him grit his teeth and square his shoulders. He had survived this long, and he wasn't about to break now. Zora was waiting for him near the center of the camp, towering as always, her golden eyes gleaming with something almost pleased. She was dressed differently today, her usual furs replaced by a more fitted set of battle leathers, her thick, ridged tail flicking lazily behind her. Around her, other warriors, dozens of them, were gathered, each wearing similar garb, all prepared for whatever trial lay ahead. You wake, Zora remarked, her smirk widening as she took him in. Good. I was beginning to think our first night together had broken you. Ron exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. You're gonna have to try harder than that. She chuckled, clearly enjoying this far too much. With a slow, deliberate motion, she gestured toward the open jungle beyond the war camp's perimeter. "Today, you prove your endurance," she said. "This is not just about running. It is about survival, about outlasting those who are weaker. We do not run for sport, we run for dominance." Ron frowned, looking past her toward the jungle. "And what happens if I don't keep up?" Zora's grin widened, her fangs gleaming in the morning light. "Then you will be left behind." The way she said it sent a clear message. This wasn't just a test of speed. It was about stamina, about pushing past the limits of exhaustion and proving that you had the will to endure. And if you failed, you didn't just lose, you were discarded. Ron inhaled deeply, adjusting his stance. "All right," he muttered, "let's do this." The warriors around them let out approving growls, the sound of low, rumbling acknowledgement of his willingness to compete. No more words were exchanged, no countdown, no signal. The moment Zora moved, the others followed, and suddenly Ron was running. The jungle blurred around him, vines and thick foliage whipping past as he forced his legs to move faster, keeping pace with the powerful warriors ahead. They ran like predators, their movements smooth, efficient, their bodies built for this kind of endurance. Ron, on the other hand, was built for short bursts of combat, for calculated strikes, not for long, grueling distances. But he adapted, focusing on his breathing, keeping his strides measured, refusing to let himself fall behind. The jungle was merciless. The ground was uneven, thick with roots and loose rocks that threatened to trip him with every step. The air was humid, heavy, clinging to his skin and making each breath feel like he was sucking in molten air. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he kept going, kept pushing forward. Around him, warriors grunted, some breaking ahead, others falling back. The weakest were already beginning to lag behind, their breath labored, their bodies unable to keep up. Ron knew if he allowed himself even a second of hesitation, he would be one of them. Zora remained ahead of him, her massive form moving with effortless grace as if this were nothing more than a casual stroll for her. She never looked back, never slowed, only pressed forward with the confidence of someone who knew she would outlast them all. It was infuriating, and yet somehow it made Ron want to push harder. Time lost meaning. The run became an endless blur of pain and determination, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch as someone stumbled. Ron could feel the strain creeping into his body, threatening to drag him down, but he shoved it aside, refusing to let himself falter. Then, just as he was starting to wonder when this madness would end, Zora did something unexpected. She changed course, veering sharply to the right. The warriors followed without hesitation, and Ron had no choice but to do the same. That's when he realized they weren't just running, they were being hunted. A deep, guttural roar shook the jungle, reverberating through the trees like a war cry. Ron's instincts flared, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move faster. Behind them, something massive crashed through the undergrowth, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls growing closer by the second. Zora let out a sharp, commanding growl. Now we see who truly endures. Ron barely had time to process her words before the first warrior behind him screamed. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. The sickening crunch that followed told him everything. This wasn't just about running until you dropped. This was about running until something else stopped you. Adrenaline surged through his veins, numbing the exhaustion, replacing it with raw, animalistic survival instinct. His feet pounded against the dirt, his breathing coming in ragged gasps as he pushed himself even harder. The sounds behind him grew more violent, snarls, heavy impacts, the wet sound of something tearing. Warriors were falling, and Ron wasn't about to be one of them. The terrain became even more treacherous, the jungle thickening, the ground sloping downward. Roots jutted up like grasping fingers, vines tangled underfoot, but he kept moving, kept dodging, kept surviving. And then suddenly there was light. The jungle thinned, revealing a wide clearing at the base of a towering rock formation. Warriors who had made it ahead of him were already gathering there, panting, some bruised, some bleeding, but all alive. Ron didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, pushing through the last stretch, his body screaming in protest as he finally burst into the clearing. And then, as if on cue, the roars behind him stopped. The pursuing beast did not follow them into the open space. It lingered at the jungle's edge, snarling, packing, but unwilling to step any further. Ron didn't dare turn and get a good look at it. He was too busy trying not to collapse. Zora stood nearby, watching as the last few warriors trickled in. Some didn't make it. No one spoke of them. She approached him, golden eyes gleaming with approval. You did not fall. Ron let out a breathless half-laugh, half-wheeze. Wasn't an option. She chuckled, reaching out, gripping his shoulder with a firm, almost possessive hand. You endure, she murmured. That is good. Ron wasn't sure if it was good. All he knew was that he had survived, and somehow he was starting to understand why he didn't hate proving himself to her. Ron had been exhausted before, but this was something else entirely. His lungs burned, his legs felt like they were made of lead, and every muscle in his body screamed at him for putting them through hell. The moment he crossed into the clearing, he nearly collapsed, barely managing to stay on his feet as his body trembled with exertion. His pulse pounded against his skull, sweat dripped from his brow, and the heat of the jungle clung to him like a second skin. He wanted to drop, to lie back in the dirt and let the fatigue drag him into unconsciousness, but he knew better. He had made it this far, and the last thing he needed was to show any sign of weakness in front of Zora or her warriors.